Good morning and welcome to Jew in the City Speaks with your host, Allison Josephs, also known as Jew in the City. There has been some anti-Semitism brewing for, the last few thousand years, to be honest, but it's kind of gotten more acute in the last several months. Orthodox Jews have been getting attacked with more frequency in the last several years, but obviously the Kanye West comments that happened this past fall have kind of brought the anti-Semitism conversation to another level. And the truth is that I think there's something actually very good about this. There's something very good about anti-Semitism finally being talked about. It's very good that Jews from across the spectrum are seeing it more than ever, because it's not only an Orthodox problem. And even if it comes for the visibly dressed Jews first, anti-Semitism always ends up getting all Jews. There's a topic that we touched on a few months ago with someone named Dr. Joshua Karlip, who is the Denenberg Associate Professor of Jewish History and Associate Director for Center for Israel Studies at the Shiva University. The last time we brought him on the show, we talked about how there's sort of this pattern of erasure that the non-Jewish world has asked Jews to do really for a very long time, certainly since the Enlightenment, that we'll kind of get access to the non-Jewish world as long as we're willing to play down our Jewishness, which is sort of a strange dynamic in a world where other marginalized groups are celebrating what makes them different, leaning into their ethnicities. Jews continue to hide in many ways. But another thing that has kind of been on my mind is the idea of Jewish collaborators working with the enemy. It's a really painful topic, to be honest, because Jewish unity is so important. And the work that we're doing now at Jew in the City, especially our Hollywood bureau, we really are reaching across the aisle to Jews of all backgrounds, non-Jewish allies as well. As many people as we can bring into the conversation, the better. But there are some Jews that have always thrown Jews under the bus and continue to do it to this day. This got sort of on my mind after the dozen exposés from the New York Times on the Hasidic community. In 3 months, 12 articles were written about the Hasidic community. Now, we have a branch at Jew in the City called Tikun, which works on healing systemic issues from behind the scenes within this community. The feedback from this branch came from our Makom members who have seen the underbelly of this community. So I don't mean to say that issues don't exist, because we recognize that they do. At the same time, I don't think that this type of negative attention in a period when this community is already literally punching bags on the street is in any way a helpful or positive thing. If anything, this type of public attack makes community leaders kind of circle the wagons, and it puts Jews in literal danger. And these articles were written by Jews. All of them were written by Jews. Another thing that just came out this past week is called You People. It is a horribly anti-Semitic movie that is sort of packaged with humor in order to kind of distract from the fact that it is anti-Semitic on so many levels, and is co-written and starred by a Jew named Jonah Hill. And so this is also giving cover to the movie and having people say, but how could it be anti-Semitic? A Jew did it. And so we're bringing Dr. Karlip to talk to us today about what are the patterns throughout Jewish history of where we've seen Jews collaborating with anti-Semites before, because the more that we understand our past, the more we'll understand our present. So Dr. Karlip, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Allison. It's really great to be back with you.
So, I think I just gave like a good introduction as to why people should learn their history. So I hope that helps your profession more. If you could start back, we were kind of chatting about this earlier, and obviously, Jewish history professors specialize in certain periods of time. And so, definitely take the time that is your specialty, with the most in-depth piece. But I think there's certainly a pattern that we've seen starting from the very beginning, starting from the Torah. We were talking about collaborators, right? So if you could kind of just lead us in, what are some of the earliest examples of Jews, kind of taking the Jewish people down from within?
Right. So here I'm talking, when I can talk about the Parsha, I'm not talking as a historian, I'm talking as a religious Jew, as a committed Jew. And we all know we're now going into Parshat Bishalach. So a few weeks ago in Parshat Shmot, there's that scene when Moshe Rabbeinu, when Moses, he strikes down the Egyptian who was brutally beating a Jewish slave and an Israelite slave, and then he goes out and he sees two Jews fighting, and he says, why are you hitting each other? And one turns to him and says, what are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? And at that point, Moses has to run away, and he understands. And our tradition identifies, the Midrash, our rabbis identify these two fighters as Datan va'Aviram, the big troublemakers. And they were, according to Chazal, they were informants. They were informants to Pharaoh. So our tradition understands, that there were Jews, as you said, who throw other Jews under the bus for immediate or for long-term gratification from the very beginning.
Okay, so all right, so that puts us back 3,000 plus years.
Yeah.
When's the next time that we see something like this come up?
Well, I mean, in a sense, it's ongoing, but the most obvious example is the Hanukkah story. And the story of the Hellenizers in the time of Antiochus, and we know, for instance, we know, for instance, about the it was actually the Hellenist leaders, people like Menelaus, who introduced, all sorts of, the nude Olympics for the Kohanim, and they even tried to hide their circumcisions, and things like that. And it was actually more of a civil war. The story of Hanukkah is more of a civil war. With the Hellenizers and the Mityavnim going and goading, the Antiochus to enforce Hellenization on these recalcitrant Jews who refused to go along, than it was, just an outward persecution. And of course, no historical events are exactly the like, but there are many, many similarities throughout Jewish history.
Anything in the Purim story? Anything there? I'm just like going through Jewish history in my mind right now.
Not the only thing I can think offhand, but not, I mean, I don't, the only thing I can think offhand is, the famous pasuk in Megillat Esther towards the beginning, v'hashtiya kedat ein ones, that the drinking was according to the law, there was no forcing, and the rabbis again interpret this to mean that the Jews willingly, participated in Achashverosh's party. They deliberately, he was willing to provide them. It says, hashtiya kedat means, the Midrash says it was kosher wine. They weren't forced to drink, but the idea was, of course, to bring them, to acculturate them and to erase boundaries, which led in motion to what eventually did. That's the only hint that I can think of, but there may be others.
And our last topic was about Jewish erasure, so it's kind of similar to look at these sort of side by side. We didn't talk about this before because we did kind of have an overview of where this conversation would go, but I'm thinking of Chamsa or Bar Chamsa. Is that something that what you were going to say if I didn't mention that now? Is that the next one on your list?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, there are more things along the way that it was, and again, I would have you, suggest that you speak to one of my colleagues who's an expert in the Beit Sheni, the ancient period, who could really get into this. But we know that again, it was the Jews and it was the Jewish leadership that invited Rome, that invited Rome into Judea, and we know, or invited at least Rome to take sides, in an internal dispute. And we know what the results of that were. And, one thing, I'll just, as I say, on the one hand, the historian in me says, no two events are alike, but, William Faulkner did say the past, isn't dead. It's not even the past, right? And Jews tend to have debates amongst themselves and include the outside world. making themselves oblivious. I'm not saying they are oblivious, but they make themselves oblivious or feign being oblivious to the fact that our enemies are standing on the sideline and rejoicing. What's going on now, for instance, some of the vitriolic things that, I'm not taking any sides in this current debate in Israel about, let's say, the Supreme Court and things like that. But some of the vitriolic things that are being said by opponents about, the end of democracy in Israel, it's like, Israel's enemies, both, Jewish and non-Jewish, are standing by and clapping, and the people who are saying this are not talking in a vacuum, but they are acting as if this is these are internal debates and internal quotes, when in fact their enemies are listening and rejoicing.
I want to just clarify also the Kamsa Bar Kamsa story. So yes, Jews invited Rome in, but then in that particular story, because this individual felt slighted at a party, just clarify to those who don't know this story from the Talmud, 2 guests were invited to a party with similar names. One was not meant to be invited because he was the enemy of the host, but he got invited because his name was similar. He was told to leave and was very embarrassed and offered to pay for his meal. Then he offered to pay for a lot of meals in the entire party, and the host still threw him out in front of the rabbis, which were told that, the leaders of the generation saw this embarrassment occurring, didn't do anything, which is another message we can glean from that. But he actually set the Jewish people up when they offered an offering to Rome. When he had Rome bring an offering to the Jews, to the temple, to be sacrificed, he slit the tongue to make the offering wouldn't be kosher, that it would be rejected. And he told them that they were going to rebel against you. My proof is that they won't accept your offering. Because the tongue was slit, it was not kosher for sacrifice. And so he set up the Jews sort of as an act of revenge, which I guess then leads me to a question, and we can kind of keep on going through history. What's the motivation? You said some of it is for self-preservation, but it seems like sometimes it's for revenge, it seems like. What do you?
Yes, look, I'm a historian, not a psychologist, but I would say that, how many of the people, Allison, the people that you have been combating, in the press, on Netflix, it's an issue of that they have personal issues with their own upbringing, with their families, right? And they are demonizing an entire community as a result. So, yeah.
Right. I do just want to insert for a moment here, sort of that push and pull of the rabbis seeing something very bad happen, public humiliation happen, which we're told is worse than murder, and staying silent. I do think that we have a very strong responsibility as religious Jews to speak up when we see atrocities happening in our midst, to not cover up, to, protect the vulnerable, to, not stand idly by our neighbor's blood, as the Torah commands. Right. So there is that very grave responsibility to take these laws seriously. At the same time, even if someone did do abuse or did cover up abuse, that's certainly not the entire Jewish community. And when these stories of pain are then shared with the media, but then a word on the people that may have been hurt by Jewish people, there's lots of us, most of us are innocent, and it becomes dangerous for all of us, including you, to, lash out and take the whole community down.
Right. No, 100%. And I think this is also a key. And then I'd like to, let's move to some of the periods that I can talk more with more authority as a historian. Who's your audience, right? Who's your audience, right? When the rabbis, had definitely, somebody one time said to me that I'm blaming Jewish self-introspection, or looking, for anti-Semitism, Jews looking at their faults. And I'm not doing that. Judaism, an essential element of Judaism is cheshbon hanefesh, tshuva, right? But when you see these messages in Chazal, in what rabbis say throughout the generations, this is a message directed towards their fellow Jews internally within the Jewish community, motivated from love. If you have a message, and I said this about the person that I wrote this article, who was demonizing Orthodoxy, someone in academia, and somebody responded, well, he himself is observant, and he's, it's motivated by caring. So my response is, if it's motivated by caring, do it within the community. Once you publish in tablet, once you publish, in publications that everyone reads, then it's an external thing. And then, and also, it's also how you say it and what you say, but, it's also where you publish. If you're publishing it deliberately so the outside community can cheer you on, and that community can be more stigmatized, then that's not motivated from love.
Yeah, so I actually just wrote an article about with rising anti-Semitism on one hand, and also understanding real systemic issues that have to be dealt with within the community. On the other hand, I think there is a grave responsibility of Orthodox publications to give space to continue to talk about what is going wrong and how we can work to fix it, because those issues should be talked about. We are a community that, like you said, does a calculation of the soul, a reflection of the soul every day as a value, ongoing idea of tshuva, of repentance. So those conversations certainly need to happen. They need to happen with leadership. They need to happen on a communal level, and also taking those conversations to too big of a place could mean life and death a situation for Jews.
Absolutely. I just wanted to say one more thing before we jump to the other things, and that is, I think that ironically, these harsh critics of Orthodoxy and of Israel, and in America, a lot of times they're linked, because these are two groups that stubbornly refuse to give up their thick Jewish identities. What they need to learn, ironically, is the lesson from many Haredi rabbis who opposed the creation of the state of Israel in 1948, but with the exception of the Satmar Rebbe, after the state was created, said, whatever our criticism is, it's an internal one, and we can't do anything to delegitimize Israel because we're putting millions of Jews at risk. So I saw a beautiful quote from Rav Henkin, it was a great posek within the right-wing Orthodox Lithuanian, Jewish world in New York earlier in the 20th century. And he wrote in the 1950s, I didn't even agree with Agudat Yisrael's decision to sign the Declaration of Independence in 48. But now that the state was created, anyone who puts it at risk, anyone who goes to the non-Jewish world and joins in the war against Israel is a rodef, right? Is someone who's putting the lives of millions of Jews at stake. And would that the critics of it, the Jewish critics of Israel today, adopt that attitude?
I know, and I guess the other thing that I'm wondering, is it just, does some of it come from, we said, self-preservation, the need to be spiteful, and maybe not realizing how dangerous it is, how much Jew hatred there is and has always been, and how sort of any opening to create more animosity towards the community could have such seriously negative ramifications on so many innocent people. I think it's a certain lack of just like maybe not thinking through, kind of what the end result will be of, kind of going off onto an article or social media to complain that there are real ramifications, life and death ones, for the community.
For some people, it's like that. I wish I could think that that's the case for so many. For many, I think it's more sinister. For many, I think that, it's when a Jew today demonizes Israel or demonizes the Orthodox community in a public forum, they are consciously joining the many against the few, right? And they're consciously joining a community that will cheer them as a good Jew, for joining their side. And they know that despite all the protests, and they will say the Zionists are trying to silence us, and the Orthodox, they know deep down that these are communities that, just want to live in peace. and just want not to have all this hostility. So therefore, there's very little those communities are going to, or if anything, that those communities can do to them back. And so think about in the medieval period, we talked going through history. There was always a steady stream in every generation of Jews in Christian lands who converted to Christianity, right? And, think about it. They're surrounded by this sea of hostility, right? And telling them that they murdered their God, right? That they murdered Jesus, that they are basically the devil incarnate, accusing them of every horrific crime that anyone could not even imagine. And it's only natural that there's going to be some people in every generation who take it to heart, right? And internalize the critique, internalize the hatred, or simply just want to run away to this and have safety with the oppressor rather than be part of the oppressed. And so therefore, and then they become in turn the biggest mouthpieces, right, of anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism. So, the disputation, the Paris disputation, 1242. Who was it? It was Nicholas Donin, a Jewish convert to Christianity. Who was it in the 1260s? It was against Ramban. It was Pablo Cristiani, also a convert, right? And right through the line. Now, I want to get to say a few words about German Jewry, in the modern era, because that's when this really developed the form that it has to this day. German Jews were told from the beginning, starting in the late 18th century, if you want emancipation, emancipation as citizens, you need to regenerate. It was a quid pro quo, rights for regeneration. You Jews are degenerate. You speak this degenerate German, Yiddish. You are moneylenders. You're peddlers. You cheat. You're ugly. You're dirty. You live in these dank ghettos. Get yourself educated. Get yourself, look European. Speak like a proper European, and then maybe we'll give you your rights. And German Jewry, as a whole, really imbibed this, from the leaders down. It really starts with the Haskalah, with Moses Mendelssohn. I have a couple quotes for you. Moses Mendelssohn, who in other ways, defended the Jewish community. I'm not trying to make this too one-dimensional. This is what he had to say about Yiddish, which he himself grew up speaking. Quote, "This jargon has contributed not little to the immorality of the common man," amongst the Jews, right? But speaking German would lead to morality. Heinrich Gretz, the great German Jewish historian of the 19th century, who also in other venues defended the Jews, hated Polish Jews, hated the Ostjuden, right? This is what he said about Polish Jews. He said, and I have a quote here, and I'll just read you he basically blamed them, he blamed the Polish Jews for coming to Germany, serving as the rabbis and the malamdim who taught the youth. And he said about them, to their care, or rather to their neglect, were entrusted the Jewish youth, who as soon as they could talk were introduced to the Talmud after the sophistical artificial method. Through this perversity, the language of the German Jews, like that of the Poles, degenerated into a repulsive stammer, and their manner of thinking and love of disputation into crabbed dogmatism that defied all logic. This kind of hatred, it didn't originate with the German Jews, with Mendelssohn. It originated with the German non-Jewish anti-Semites, but it was internalized by the leadership, the Haskalah, and then it penetrated. And German Jews believe that they have to rid themselves of these characteristics. And so there's a wonderful book called Brothers and Strangers, the East European Jew and German Jewish Consciousness by Stephen Asheim, a retired professor at Hebrew University, where he talks about this process where first the German Jew felt they had to rid themselves of the ghetto within themselves. But then they put all those negative character traits onto the Ostjuden, onto the East European Jews, and hated the East European Jews, right, for their thick Jewish identity, right, through their Yiddish, through their clothing, for everything. And when anti-Semitism increased, even though the German Jews were acculturating, even though the majority of them became Reformed, et cetera, many German Jews blamed that on the presence of the Ostjuden, right? And
literally out of the New York Times articles today, it's such a similar dynamic.
It's such a similar dynamic, and I think one chilling conclusion that Aschheim gives in his book is that in the early 1920s, the Ostjuden were being attacked on the streets of Berlin, on the streets of Germany. And basically all the anti-Semitism was being unleashed on these Ostjuden. And many of the native German Jews were saying, well, what do you expect? We have to limit immigration. We have to, make sure they don't come here and bother us too much. 20 years later, less than 20 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later, in the 1930s, it was all German Jews. So it starts with the most visible Jews. It starts with the Ostjuden, who today's grandchildren are the Hasidim in Williamsburg, right? But it eventually comes to all of us, and I think that's the lesson we need to remember.
We have about 2 minutes left, but I don't want to miss Russia, because there's also a dynamic on Russia, Russian Jews that, kind of collaborated with the enemy. So can you tell us a little about the Russian story?
Yeah. Well, it starts a little bit in the 19th century when Maskilim imbibed this message from the German Maskilim, petitioned the Tsarist government to ban traditional Jewish clothing in the Pale of Settlement. And then, by the way, they write at the end of their letter, "Dear Tsar, please don't reveal our names to the rabbis." So they're playing a double game. They themselves are wearing, the clothing when until, and pretending to be part of the community, but they're really, bad-mouthing the community. And then, of course, how did it play itself out? Russian police, Tsarist Russian police, would throw Jewish men down on the street and shave their beards and payas. They would pull the tichel off of women, etc. This had the offshoot of this was during the communist era. When the Yevsektia, the Jewish sections of the Communist Party, were much more zealous than the Soviet government in shutting down. They shut down thousands of chadarim, thousands of traditional Jewish schools, yeshivot, thousands of synagogues. They reported people who had brit milah, and they were thrown in prison. And this was all done by Jews against Jews, and so therefore they could this insulated the government, the Soviet regime, against charges of anti-Semitism, right? Just as the same way today, when sometimes the harshest critics of Israel will be Jews, will be former Israelis, right, etc. And then they'll say, and then I'll write an op-ed saying they're using classic anti-Semitic argumentation, and their response will be this outrage. How could you say we're anti-Semitic? We're Jewish. We're Israeli. So it's the same process.
Calling out this movie, You People, the response that I'm getting is, but it was co-written and starred by a Jew. We're out of time. I don't think we actually have an answer to how to solve this, but I think it is important that we recognize that anti-Semitism can come from within. We have to be alert. We have to not be afraid to call it out. We need to be able to explain the pattern that this has existed for a very long time, and it leads to danger towards Jews. Professor Karlip, thank you so much for elucidating the past for our listeners, and hopefully it will give us some more insights for the future.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Allison, and I really appreciate all your work.
Thanks so much, and thanks for listening. You can catch us same time, same place next week. Bye-bye.